Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Maxim Gorky's play Yegor Bulychov and Others. This is a 1931 play. Gorky was one of the great Russian/Soviet writers. He began writing prior to the Russian Revolution in 1917, I believe, and he carried through into the period of the Soviet Union. He wrote a wide range of things, I think plays, novels, poetry, and we're going to talk about Yegor Bulychov and Others, which is a play. And it's an interesting play, in part because it reflects some of the ideological commitments of Soviet communism. It reflects some of the values of the communists, but it's actually not set in the Soviet Union. It's set really in 1917, at the start of Red October, at the start of the Bolshevik Revolution, and Bulychov is very distinctly not a communist. Bulychov is of the merchant class. He seems to be what we might call upper middle class, maybe. So within the Tsarist system, he is not an aristocrat. He's not a noble. He is a commoner, but he's very wealthy. And he's wealthy because of his business, right? He was a businessman. Now, Bulychov is older. He has a disease, cancer, and he's dying. He doesn't know that he's dying. He knows he might die, but he thinks that he's going to recover, and he's trying to do everything in his power to recover. But as the play goes on, he becomes less and less convinced that there is anything that can be done to alleviate his condition. And as that happens, he becomes more and more cynical about every aspect of life in Tsarist Russia. The Tsar and the Duma, which is the Russian parliament, he becomes more and more cynical about their ability to govern the country in an effective way. He becomes very disillusioned with the war effort. That's World War I, where Russia suffered horrendous losses on the Eastern Front. And that was a big thing that drove the Red October Revolution in 1917, was popular discontent about these losses. He becomes disillusioned with the monarchy and the aristocratic system that had been in place in Russia in different forms or fashions for centuries. He becomes disillusioned with the war effort. He becomes disillusioned with religion. His sister-in-law is an abbess, I think. She runs a convent. Yeah, she's an abbess. Melania is an abbess. He also encounters Father Pavlin, who's a priest, and he says a number of heretical things. From the perspective of Melania and Pavlin, they're very heretical things that Bulychov says to them, but they're quite logical in their own way. And then most of the other characters who surround Bulychov, who sort of cycle in and out of his presence, are primarily concerned about trying to get money out of him in one way or another, whether that's inheritance, whether that's investment opportunities, whatever it is, whether that's business advice, which usually correlates with investment opportunities in this case, whatever it is, right? So this is actually a very traditional storyline, right? This sort of idea. The one that I'm sort of most familiar with, and actually I say most familiar with, I haven't read it in almost 20 years, I think. I think the last time I read this was when I was an undergrad, was Ben Jonson's play Volpone, in which this old, wealthy guy pretends to be sickening for his end so that he can find out who actually cares about him versus who just wants his money, right? And it's this, if I remember the play correctly, it's basically this sort of parade of people each trying to dupe him into giving him their money. So this storyline of an old, wealthy guy who is sick, who is dying, and the people around him are trying to sort of parasite off of him, is definitely a recognized storyline. And so Bulychov becomes increasingly disillusioned with business, with the class that he is a part of. He becomes increasingly distraught and upset that everyone seems to just be interested in his money. So that's one component of this. That's really, I would say, sort of the major component of this. And interestingly enough, that is where this play becomes very pro-socialist, right? Bulychov is not a socialist. He never becomes a socialist in the play. He doesn't espouse socialist principles, though there are socialist characters, and there are characters who support the revolution, etc., etc. Yegor Bulychov himself is not one of them. But in his increasing cynicism about the conditions of life, the norms of Tsarist Russia, he moves toward the kinds of critiques made by the socialists. So, some of these things occur very, very early in the play. Like, basically from the beginning, Bulychov is opposed to the war. He thinks it's being poorly run, which of course it was. The Russians did a terrible job in World War I. And so he expresses this to Father Pavlin. So Bulychov says, wait a minute, Shurya. That's his illegitimate daughter who lives with him, who seems to be one of about the only maybe 3 people that he actually likes. His attention. What will those people do now? He's talking about people who have been crippled during the war. We had plenty of useless people as it was before the war. We should have kept out of it. And Pavlin, sighing, says, policies of the higher powers. Bulychov says, our policies went wrong with the Japanese too, and the result was we disgraced ourselves before the whole world. That's a reference to the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. 4, I want to say. Basically, there was a war between Russia and Japan, and the Russians thought that they would win. They thought they would do quite well, because Japan was an East Asian nation, and Russia is a European nation. And so there were these sort of assumptions about Asian superiority, rooted in racism, etc., etc. And the Japanese, who since the 1860s really had massively modernized their military and strengthened their country on a sort of Western imperialist model, just obliterated the Russians. Part of that was because the Russians were overconfident. Part of it was because the Russians did not really, like, the Russian military was not well run. in this period. And part of it was that the Japanese were just really, really prepared for modern combat in a way that the Russians were not. And so Pavlin responds to this. He says, "But war does not only cause destruction, it makes a man richer both in experience and in..." And Bulychov cuts him off and says, "Some do the fighting, others the fleecing." So he's clearly already cynical about the war effort. And he challenges Pavlin on political issues and on religious issues. And one of the things that we see, this is where it starts, and this is like a few pages in to the play, right? It's not very far in. And this is where we start to really see one of the big principles of the Soviet Union, which was state atheism. There's actually a group which I think has one of the greatest names of any group in history. It's got different names. The League of the Militant Atheists. When I was an undergrad, I had a professor who specialized in Russian and Eastern European history. And I think the phrase he used was League of the Militant Godless, which I think is such a great name. But it was like the League of the Militant Atheists, the League of the Godless, things like that. So different names depending on how it's translated. So that was a big component of Soviet state policy because the Russian Orthodox Church was a major exploiter of the common people, right? It owned massive amounts of land, massive amounts of wealth, up through the abolition of serfdom in the 1860s. It owned massive numbers of human beings, etc., right? So incredibly corrupt. And one of the things that happens in Gorky's play is that Pavlin sort of reflects both the church as a political wing of the state, what Louis Althusser would call an ideological state apparatus, that is a non-state structure or whatever it is that endorses the power of the state, the norms of the state, etc., etc. And Pavlin also reflects ecclesiastical corruption, the intersection of religious and financial interests. So Bulychov says, you talk about the higher powers, the will of God and all that. Well, what about the Duma? Where does that come in? Again, the Duma is this Russian parliament. And some people initially, at the sort of outbreak of the Red October Revolution, sort of wanted the Duma to take charge, wanted a democratic society on the model of sort of a parliamentary democracy. And that was not ultimately what ended up happening. But so Pavlin says the Duma is, in a manner of speaking, a self-diminution of authority. Many people even assume it to be a fatal error, but it is unbecoming for a minister of the church to inquire into such matters. Moreover, it is incumbent upon the clergy and our duty to fire a spirit of good cheer and cultivate a love of for king and country. Ideological state apparatus. Bulychov says, up in fire and down in smoke. Pavlin says, as you are aware, I have persuaded the church warden of my temple to enlarge the choir, and I've also had a talk with General Betlin concerning a donation toward a bell for the new church that is being built to the glory of your patron saint, the blessed Yegor. Bulychov says, and he gave you nothing. Pavlin says, he refused and even made an indelicate joke. I don't like brass even in the regimental bands, he says. Now a donation from you toward the bell would be just the thing, considering your ill health. Bulychov, rising, says, you don't cure illnesses by bell ringing. Pavlin says, you never know. The causes of illness are not known to science. In some foreign sanitariums, I hear they cure disease by music. We too have a member of the fire brigade. He ministers to the sick by playing the trumpet. So, right, we get this element of the church's role being a mix of running cover for the Tsarist government and feathering its own nest, we'll call it, and sort of raking in money through asking the rich for donations, through collections, through this sort of promise of like, give us money and your sins will be forgiven, right? There's this very sort of medieval selling of indulgences kind of corruption here, ecclesiastical corruption. That being said, as I pointed out before, Bulychov never becomes a socialist. He's not. It's not in his class interest, right? He is a merchant. He is a capitalist. But there are these sort of interesting questions that come up about the revolution, right? About the Soviet Revolution. And many people... So Bulychov has some people in his circle who are dedicated to the revolution, right? And others who are very much opposed to it. So he has this one conversation that has this very interesting couple of bits. So he's having a conversation with a guy named Bashkin. And Bashkin, I think, is a family friend. Something like this. Or Bashkin might be a servant. I can't remember. This is like a Russian novel, right? Where there's just a ton of characters. And they're especially hard to keep track of because a lot of the characters have both a name and a diminutive nickname. So, like, Senya is Bulychov's wife, but she's also called Aksinya. Varvara is his daughter, but she's also called Varya. Alexandra is his daughter, his illegitimate daughter, but she's also called Shura. So you've got just 2 names for a lot of these people. So it gets confusing for me. It would be easier if I were watching this, because then I could say, okay, that's a different human being than that one. But so Bashkin is reporting on this group of people, including people from their sort of circle or Bulychov's friend group, who have been arrested for being revolutionaries. And Bulychov asks, all of the down with the Tsar kind? Bashkin says, all kinds. Some against the Tsar, some against the rich, others against all the rich, wanting the workers to run the state. Bulychov says, nonsense. Bashkin says, of course. Bulychov says, they'll drink the state away. Bashkin says, that's just it. This is one of the interesting lines here. Bulychov says, yes. But what if they don't? And that's a super interesting line because there's a ton of different ways that as an actor you could inflect that, right? That pause, yes, they'll drink the state away, but what if they don't? That can carry so many different meanings depending on how it's delivered, right? So then Bashkin says, what else can they do without the bosses? Bulychov says, you're right. They'd never be able to get along without you and Vasha Dostagayev. Bashkin says, you're a boss too. Bulychov says, to be sure I am. Now what is it they sing, you say? Bashkin, sighing, says, we have done with the old world. Bulychov says, and then? Bashkin says, shake its dust from our feet. And Bulychov says, sounds like a prayer. Again, I think that's such an interesting line because depending on the way that is delivered, it can mean a number of different things, right? Again, Bulychov is not a communist. He is not a socialist. It's not in his class interest. But he seems to be open to the possibility that maybe the systems of Tsarist Russia have failed, and a different system might do better for the people. Anyway, so I'm reading this play out of this collection, Classic Soviet Plays, and one of the things that this collection includes that I think is really, really cool is images at the end of each of the plays. So this is a playbill designed by V. Mayakovsky from Petrograd, 1918. We got some different designs here, set designs, things like this. So very, very cool. This is an interesting little collection. Yeah,